Hi, readers. Welcome to Goddess Garden Book Club and chat for adults who love a good novel, regardless of the genre, weirdness, the planet it takes us to, or the openness we find on the pages. I'm so glad that you're here. If you are here for the first time, welcome. We're glad to have you. If you're a returning club member or subscriber, it means the world to me that you're here and that you support all these amazing works we've been reviewing. Hopefully, you'll always be a part of the conversation. So I always want you to be comfortable, be welcome, to be aware, because the topics that we discuss in this club include everything from basement dungeons to other worlds. I'll read them all and share them in this safe space. So whether it's morning, noon, or night, I'm happy you're a part of the conversation. I also invite you to the social pages that I have. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into some books that I've shared, or if you want to share some books that you've been reading that you'd like to talk about. As I've always said, there's something for everybody, and today have I got a good book for us. We're going to review the book The Shining, and we're also going to talk about the movie, the 1980 film by Stanley Kubrick, The Shining. This book was first published in January of 1977, and you know me, it's always the audiobook. It was narrated by Campbell Scott, and may I say it was done brilliantly. He was an excellent choice to read this book, and I'm glad that I got to enjoy that. This discussion is going to focus on the comparisons of the characters in the book versus the characters in the movie, more so than the directors and the author's version that they created, to ensure that our focus is on an outstanding horror story. Because I have to be honest with you, I didn't look at it as a horror story until I read the book. The Shining is a haunting tale of generational trauma, addiction, and madness. It's important to remember either or both of those things because I didn't have that information going into the movie, and I saw the movie first. I know that I've seen the movie more than once, and so as I was reading the book, elements of the movie resonated with me. Um, let's also remember that the version of the film also shows there's this version out there, I should say, that shows that they do a walkthrough of the property, and the property visual is of the topiary and not of the maze. I want to say that's the remake of The Shining, but I'm not for sure, and I'm not going back to check it out. So it is what it is. If you remember that, hit me up in the comments and let me know. But I'm almost certain I have seen the film version of the topiary coming to life. So let's get into it. The Shining is a masterclass of psychological horror, weaving together supernatural elements with a profound exploration of human fragility. The film in 1980 created a visually iconic movie. That, without reproach, is a very true statement. Yet it has significant changes from where it transitions from the pages to the screen. And we're going to dive into some major highlights focusing on character development and the role of the Overlook Hotel in the novel's use of the foreshadowing through Danny's visions. So let's talk a little about our favorite character, Jack Torrance. Um, and I want to ask this question: is Jack a more terrifying version when he is his madness is slowly being revealed, or whether when he shows up and he's already teetering on the edge? And that's the difference between the book and the movie. He shows up teetering on the edge in the film, but that is not the case in the book. In the book, you get to see how deeply flawed and tragic person Jack really is. His descent into madness is very gradual, and it's rooted in his troubled past. It's rooted in alcoholism, abuse, and a strained family relationship. Um, Jack's internal struggle is that he wants to redeem himself, but he's haunted by his failings, and he has quite a few. His love for his family, um, how can I put this? His love for his family is genuine. I want to believe Jack loved his family, but his inability to conquer his demons ultimately doom him. His unraveling feels slow and personal, creating sympathy even as his behavior becomes more erratic. But in the movie, Jack is already on the edge at the outset. And if you look closely, his madness is much more overt, and the audience gets the impression that Jack is unstable from the beginning. The movie focuses less on Jack's internal battle and more on his transformation into the vessel of the hotel's evil influence. But that is half the story by far, and as a result, his character feels less nuanced than in the book. And full disclosure, I literally did not look at that movie as a horror movie because it was just watching somebody teeter on madness and then give into it. And I had a lot of questions because I hadn't read the book as to how this all came to be. So, more about that later. Let's talk about Wendy Torrance. Um, Wendy is portrayed as a strong and capable mother who fiercely protects Danny from Jack's increasing validity. Because Jack has these weird highs and lows, and at the height of his validity, Jack is volatile and dangerous. At the low point, he's depressed, he's sad, and he tends to give in to his internal weaknesses. And while she is afraid, she's resourceful and she's determined. And that does shine through as she tries to hold her family together. But that's in the book. In the movie, Wendy is much more submissive and she's fearful, often appearing overwhelmed by Jack's rage. Um, she approaches him almost in a skittish way, even though this is her husband. Her character lacks depth and the strength to see what's been brewing. Versus in the novel, Wendy's very aware of what has been brewing and watching her husband very closely, and it makes her appear more passive in the movie, as a victim rather than an active participant in the story's events. Because trust me, Wendy is not a passive person in this experience. She is fully present, and I like her character so much more in the novel because of how she protects Danny and even tries to love Jack despite his failings, but she realizes that there's nothing she can do. Now, in the book, Danny, let's talk a little about Danny and his visions that really work better as a narrative tool, and they build dread in the novel over the visceral aspects of seeing it visually and the way that they're represented as impacts on Danny. Danny's psychic abilities, or his shining, as he is told by the caretaker, are central to this story, both the film and the book. His connection to the Overlook and his frightening visions create a sense of impending doom throughout the novel. Because before Danny ever sets foot on that property, he is forewarned about what's waiting for him. And Danny is a fully developed character. He has agency in his visions and understanding of what's going on around him, what's happening, help to elevate him beyond the role of a mere child. You get the sense that this is an old soul trapped in a child's body. Um, in the movie, Danny's visions are present, but the film doesn't really explore his character or the nature of his shining as thoroughly as the book does. You just sort of realize he has this imaginary friend that he talks to, and then he communicates with one of the hotel employees, and through that communication, he is identified as having the shining. Nothing ever prepares him for. Nobody's ever having the conversation in the movie about Danny shining, but in the book, this is a conversation that they've not only had with a medical professional, it's something that they have found as a couple, Jack and Wendy. It's being misdiagnosed because it's deeper. And they know it's deeper because of the way that Jack will interpret things that he's not supposed to know, or say things that he wasn't privy to, but because he can read minds, not shown in the film, but Daddy can read your mind in the movie. And it explains to them just how Danny is tapped into what's going on. Um, the Overlook Hotel is, by my definition, a character in itself. The Overlook Hotel is more frightening when it's portrayed as a malevolent entity with a rich backstory, as it does in the book, um, because the Overlook Hotel is a malevolent force with a rich haunted history. You really don't get the history of the hotel from the film. The hotel isn't just a setting, it provides a deep backstory with past owners, past guests, tragedies that have occurred there, creating a sense of foreboding long before anything supernatural happens. The Overlook's manipulation of Jack and the way that it feeds on his weakness, you start to understand. And you really do see the hotel's motivation as it seeks to absorb Danny's power, um, by using Jack as a tool, making Jack think that the hotel really wants him to be a part of things. But really, the hotel is trying to strip the psychic abilities, the mind reading abilities, and the strength that Danny has through his shining. And that's a really key element that I don't think that that the movie completely nailed. Now, in the movie, The Overlook is visually stunning, but it's much more of a backstory, and it's really not explored. Um, Let me see, how can I put this without getting way too deep into spoilers? The hotel feels like a setting. Um, it's set up like it's a setting for Jack's descent into madness rather than an entity with its own sinister will. And the result is more ambiguous supernatural presence. The audience is never quite sure. It's never entirely sure if the hotel is truly evil or if Jack's insanity is a responsibility of what's all going on. It's Jack so crazy that these things manifest in the hotel versus the hotel is so evil it brings about these things and Jack is included in them. That was not clear to me in the film. That left me with a lot of questions. But again, I made the mistake of seeing the film first. My fault. The lack of clarity works well for the film, in some people's opinion, though. So I'm not going to yuck your yum if you thought it nailed it completely. But I thought it lacked a lot of the depth that was provided in the novel by Stephen King. Um, so that's all I'll say about that. Let's talk about Danny's foreshadowing, which is also very important. One of the most effective narrative tools that Stephen King used, is Danny's psychic abilities, which foreshadow the terror to come. His visions act as a lens through which the reader anticipates the horror without fully understanding it until it unfolds. Danny's visions are deeply unsettling, and they serve as warnings not just for the reader, but for Danny himself. His reoccurring image of the word red rum, um, builds tension as it becomes clear that violence is inevitable. And again, this shows itself before they get to the hotel. And I listened to the audiobook, so I didn't have the pleasure of reading it, but I'm sure, um, it wasn't just because I had seen the movie that when I heard Red Rum for the first time, I knew exactly what it was. I think if I had been reading the book, looking at it, it would have made sense to me what was coming through versus um, the way it sort of showed up in the movie, if that makes any sense. The visions are cryptic and they're horrifying, and they're designed to manipulate. The implications of these visions give a sense of inevitable danger, and the deeper understanding of Danny's psychic power and his ability to connect with both the hotel and Dick Halloran. That's the caretaker, the guy that um, sort of walked them around, showed them the ropes, and told Danny he had to shine him. It creates a larger supernatural framework that enhances the horror. Um, and again, I'm speaking strictly of the book. In the movie, Danny's visions are present and they're used more for shock value, such as that famous elevator scene with all the blood. And Stanley Kubrick opted for striking visual symbolism, but the film doesn't really fully explore the significance between the visions and and his shining ability. And it really doesn't do a great job with his friend Tony. And as a result, they act more as an abstract portent of doom rather than a detailed foreshadowing of specific events that have happened in the past that are culminating in this perfect storm of horror for this family. The audience is left to interpret all of these things when you watch the movie, which sort of fits with, I guess, the Kubrick ambiguity tone. But it really didn't work well for this particular book because it left me personally with a lot of questions. And one of the key elements and questions I had takes place in the book because it's the role of the scrapbook. There is a scrapbook that Jack finds when he starts to work there. I think it's in the basement where he is working with the boilers, where he finds this. And it's a key element that doesn't make it into the film at all. And the scrapbook is really important to the Overlook Hotel. It is a deep connection that Jack starts to build upon because it tells of the story, the hotel's dark history, and it symbolizes his descent into obsession and madness. The scrapbook articles and their tone is sort of set in a um, article tone. How can I put this? What am I thinking of? When you're thinking of like um, sensationalized article in a tabloid. That's what I'm thinking of, like a tabloid article. That's what these come off as. Um, they're historical scandals, and they include stories of murder, mob activity, corruption, and tragic deaths with an S of prominent figures who stayed there. Not to be nitpicky, but I really also think there's a suite in the hotel that manifests in the book that never gets talked about in the movie. The movie only talks about room 217, and that's unfortunate. But because of the scrapbook and its lurid details that fascinate Jack, he starts to think like the writer that he is. He wants to develop a story and he starts to become invested in taking the information that he finds and doing a tell-all book. And this is when he makes a phone call where you can see in the book where he's teetering on the brink of madness. He now gives over to it fully. This phone call is a game changer, and it really does tell you where Jack crosses the line. And it becomes very clear at that point as well that the hotel wants Jack to take the place of Delbert Grady. You remember Delbert Grady, the father of the twins? He was the previous caretaker who killed his family. And the hotel is grooming Jack to become that. So in Jack's mind, or I won't say in his ear, but in his ear, he is hearing that he is sought after, that he is favored, and the hotel really does like it. Now, the film streamlines the story by focusing more on Jack's psychological unraveling rather than specific historical context of the hotel. And the film does include hints of the hotel's dark past through visuals like the ghostly figures at the 1920s ballroom party and Delbert Grady's first appearances in the film. It doesn't delve into the depth of the Overlook's history the way the novel does. And by excluding the scrapbook, the movie places less emphasis on Jack's obsession with the hotel's past and more on his personal madness. And I think that's where they become two very different projects. The difference in the approach shifts the story tone. And so Stephen King's Shining is more than just a supernatural thriller. It's really a deep psychological exploration of a man's battle with his inner demons, compounded by isolation, addiction, and a dark history. The novel masterfully intertwines horror elements with human psychology, particularly through its central character. Um, and that is in question to me whether you think the central character is Jack or whether you think it's Danny. Um, Stephen King does weave Jack's personal demons with a supernatural horror flair. When you add in the whole Overlook Hotel, that creates a chilling portrait of a man in the throes of madness. The way the book and the narrator walk you into his madness and the reality of things in Jack's past that shape how this madness is manifesting really speak to the unresolved trauma that he's dealing with in his life that he brings to his relationship. Um, it's much a story about internal failures than as much as it is about external forces because Jack has both of these things working against him. And the hotel merely amplifies what's already there lurking beneath the surface. The struggle against becoming his father is so profound, and his ultimate failure to protect his family from himself, which is why he makes The Shining, which is why Stephen King, I should say, makes The Shining a haunting tale of generational trauma, addiction, and madness, which is what I said in the beginning. It really is that. So the ending of the book differs significantly. And in the novel, the Overlook is destroyed in a fiery explosion, symbolizing the triumph of good over evil, at least temporarily. In the film, the hotel remains standing, leaving a more ambiguous, eerie conclusion as Jack freezes to death in the maze. Remember that? And the haunting photo that suggests the cynical nature of his fate, that he gets absorbed as a spirit of evil doing into this property. Both the novel and the movie are horror classics in their own right, because I guess it's just how you define horror to put both of those in that way, but certainly the book. Um, but they're very different experiences. The book is a complex character study with a strong supernatural undertone, while the film focuses on psychological horror and visual storytelling, leaving a much deeper narrative for the audience to infer rather than get from sitting through the film. So, with that being said, that is The Shining in a nutshell, of the journey that I went on anyway. Stephen King never fails as an author to leave a book in that I've read with an indelible impression. It's not necessarily the words, it's the tone, it's the idea. And I'll give you an idea. I've read several of his books: Autopsy in Room 4, The Stand, The Talisman, The Dark Half, 11/22/63. They all sort of teeter on a reality that you can appreciate that takes a supernatural turn that you don't see in real life. But a what if definitely exists in all these scenarios, especially Autopsy in Room 4. For a short story, literally the most horrific thing I've ever seen written as a horror story. But let me go ahead and get to the ratings of The Shining. If you haven't figured it out yet, This is an absolute five when it comes to reading the Stephen King novel and the others that I mentioned. They are all fives in their own right. Hopefully, over our journey into books, we'll talk about these, at least a couple of them. I definitely want to talk about The Dark Half. Made a great impression on me as well. So, in closing, let's leave the focus on what books are out there and return with a great read. Now, we're going to close this chapter with a bookmark. And until we meet again, readers, thank you so much for being a part of the conversation.